Okay, welcome back to our lecture on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We are continuing talking about drugs, and we're going to talk about addiction and health. So, addiction. What is addiction? Addiction is a biological and continued involvement with a substance or activity despite the ongoing negative consequences. There is actually the American Psychiatric Association that classifies addiction as a mental health disorder and a chronic disease. So I know maybe about 15 or 20 years ago, this wasn't the case. People thought addiction was a choice, but it is a mental health disorder and a chronic disease. So, what is addiction? There is a cycle of addiction that you get into because it is a chronic disease that can be hard to get out of this cycle. So it's hard to kind of start reading over this, but there's internal frustration. We'll start here. Fantasizing about the substance or behavior, then getting into obsessing over the substance or behavior, then going ahead and using the substance or starting to be compulsive about the behavior, and then loss of control, and then getting into the depression, guilt, and shame over the behavior. You can get into cessation of use, passage of time, and then get into the cycle again. Some people over here at cessation of use do exit the cycle permanently. There is help to exit the cycle, but because it is a chronic mental health disorder, some people get stuck in this cycle for quite a long time and can relapse several times and end up in a lot of different things. So end up in relapse and end up deeper into addiction, end up their addiction can end up fatal. So a lot of different things can happen with addiction. So there are risk factors for addiction. This comes from the National Health Society, and this is kind of a silly drawing, but there are several risk factors. There's historical risk factors, which is basically previous history or learning or expectations. So learning about what is coming. So like previous history of expecting what is going to happen with this, either with this action or drug or outcome. So if the addiction is, some might say gambling. So if you have the expectation that it's going to end in flashing lights, and previous history of excitement, that can trigger brain mechanisms. Drugs is a risk factor for triggering brain mechanisms of addiction because they inherently change brain chemistry. as we've talked about. Biology is a large risk factor. There are genetic risk factors that are linked to having addiction. There's also different circadian rhythms, different disease states can put you at risk for having addiction. Having other mental health problems is actually a large risk factor for addiction. Gender can be a risk factor for addiction as well. Environment can be a risk factor for addiction. Societal interactions, family, stress, and conditioned stimuli. So conditioned stimuli really means if you have seen the thing done over and over again, you are conditioned to think that that is something that should be done. So, for instance, if you are exposed to drinking at a young age, excessive drinking, you're more likely to excessively drink when you get older. This is just another slide on risk factors, going deeper into some of those genetic components of risk factors. These are some deeper genetic components. There's nicotine metabolism. Some people have a gene that makes them more susceptible to being addicted to nicotine. There's a cannabinoid regulator. So some people have a gene that make them more susceptible to being addicted to cannabinoids or marijuana. There's a mu opioid receptor. So some people have a gene that make them more susceptible to being addicted to opioids. And environmental components. There are a lot of environmental components. If you have a history of abuse, witnessing abuse, stress, witnessing drug use, or having lots of drugs available in the environment are all risk factors for addiction. And addiction, again, is a chronic disease, just like cardiovascular disease is a disease. So there are risk factors that come along with it. They're just all different types. So how does addiction happen? So there's a really good video that goes with this, and I've linked it here. It's also linked in your module. It's a 5-minute video. I encourage you to watch that video, but I will go over it a little bit for you. So what happens really is the drug overstimulates the mechanisms that overrides the stimuli mechanisms, and it causes a buildup of dopamine. So remember, when I eat food, like my favorite food is pizza, I get a little bit of that dopamine hit, and my brain goes, "Yay, pizza!" But then about an hour afterwards, my dopamine gets reuptaked, and my brain goes back to kind of normal, but if I were to take something like cocaine, cocaine causes a really big wave of dopamine to be excreted from the cells. So you get a lot of dopamine in between the cells. And so then your cells get extremely excited. So you get an extra dopamine hit. But then the problem is cocaine then blocks your cells from reuptaking it. So it overrides that stimuli mechanism. So then what's happening is now the dopamine is trapped in between these cells. So now the dopamine, you have so much dopamine trapped in between these cells, your cells get desensitized to this dopamine. And then the next time you do it, the next time you do cocaine or the addicting behavior, you need more of it, and you need it sooner. And so, because your cells are like, oh, I need more, because that dopamine is trapped. I can't uptake it. I need to get more of it. My cells are desensitized to it. So because you've overridden that stimuli mechanism, your cells just need more and more and more of it. Eventually, where the addiction part comes in is the only thing that is rewarding, the only thing that can cause this dopamine behavior is that drug or that addiction behavior. So maybe in the beginning you took cocaine once and then your cells eventually went back to normal, but you then became addicted and your dopamine got overridden and your cells got desensitized, and the only thing that is rewarding is this drug. Pizza and their little bit of dopamine hit is no longer going to please those neuron cells. That little bit of dopamine from pizza is just not enough to get your brain cells excited. And that's how addiction happens. It's just that overriding stimuli of dopamine. So what happens to our health with addiction? So that's all great, right? We get a whole lot of dopamine in between our cells. What happens if we get too much dopamine and all we can think about is cocaine or the other behaviors? If it's something else, all we can think about is that one thing we are addicted to. So chronic artificial euphoria is actually proven to lead to depression because you can no longer get enough of it, and you're so depressed that you just need more and more and more of that euphoria. Your brain's own ability to manufacture joy becomes reduced, and it's really hard to get your brain to fire correctly. This is a brain scan of a chronic cocaine user versus so this is a normal brain, and that's kind of the brain firing correctly, and it lights up and you get lots of beautiful connections between the neurons. This is a chronic cocaine abuser, and this is after 10 days of abstinence. So 10 days after they stopped using cocaine. And then 100 days after using cocaine, after abstinence, their brain is starting to light up a little bit, but it does have a long-term effect for a while. So what happens is when your brain, when you can't get those signals out correctly, you start to have memory loss, depression, psychotic breaks. You can also, because you're breaking those synapses, You can have other problems in your health, in your physical and mental health, like future employment issues, diseases like hepatitis, which comes from sharing straws and needles, herpes, AIDS, lung diseases, so many things that come with chronic use. But a lot of it comes from breaking these synapses in your brain, can cause really long-term brain damage. So what else happens to our health with addiction? So I mentioned that addiction, you get caught in this cycle, and sometimes it can lead to death, and it does sometimes. So this is from the CDC, and from 1999 to 2019, this is the increasing numbers of overdose deaths among all ages. And then these lines in between are by female and male. So remember I said risk factor was by gender. Your gender is a risk factor. Being male is a risk factor for addiction and drug overdose. You are almost 3 times more likely to be addicted and have an overdose if you are male than if you are female. So it is not a decreasing problem. It is an increasing problem in the United States. And then, so one of my questions is, when I look at this data, is, okay, so what are people overdosing on? Or who is overdosing? Sorry, who is overdosing? So this is like a very colorful graph, and you have seen data like this before, actually, and from the CDC. One of the things is it shows you by age. This is 10 leading causes of injury deaths, unintentional injury deaths by age. And we want to pay attention to the green. It says unintentional poisoning in green. So from 10 to 14, and then it jumps from 15 to 24, and then it's number 1 from 25 to 64, right? So it's number 2 and then number 1. Unintentional poisoning sounds like, oh, that's an interesting category. That kind of sounds to me like they accidentally got something in their drink that wasn't supposed to be there, right? That is not what happened. Unintentional poisoning is a weird way for the Center for Disease Control to list overdose. Unintentional poisoning is overdosing. So from 10 to 14, it went from number 9, and then from ages 15 to 24, it's number 2 cause of death. And then it switches to being the number 1 cause of death up here for unintentional injuries. What I think is most telling and most interesting is from age 25 to 65 is, if you look deep within these numbers, it's 15,000, just over 15,000, and about 6,000 here. And about the same over here for 25 years old. you are 3 times more likely to die of an overdose if you're age 25 to 34 than you are in a motor vehicle accident. This is unintentional motor vehicle traffic accident. So I know a lot of people are, worried about driving and safety on the road, and we put so much into our car safeties and wearing our seat belts and things like that, but we don't think a lot about how do we prevent health overdosing for our own lives and the lives of the people we care about. It's a big number. So then it makes you think, okay, what are people overdosing on? And it's changed over the years. This was 1999 and this is 2019, and you can see a huge spike in this orange one. And you'll get deeper into this in lab, but the number one thing that people are overdosing on is synthetic opioids, which is other than methadone, and it's primarily fentanyl. So it's primarily people that get addicted to opioids and then seek out opioids on the street. And then fentanyl is cheap and easy to make and gets laced with different things, and they unknowingly or knowingly take it in a high amount that's not conducive with life. The next highest is psychostimulants, primarily methamphetamine. And then after that, it would be cocaine. And then after that, prescription opioids. So we have a lot of problems in the U.S. with opioids. So how can we help to prevent that's a lot of data and a lot of heartache around addiction and overdosing and things like that. How can we help this? How can we stay healthy? How can we avoid all these things? Some of you may have even experienced this. It's very prevalent. Some of you may have experienced this in your family, in your life, and whether it be with alcohol or with opioids or even things that are other types of behaviors, like pizza. So how do we stay healthy? Awareness and warning signs is really one of the things. You should be very aware of what addiction is and what the warning signs are, both for yourself and for your loved ones. And be aware of your risk factors, right? Knowing your family history, right? Do you have people in your family that have addictive behaviors? Because then you might have one of those genetic components. Knowing the risk factors about, do you have a history of being in an environment that could cause leading to being addicted. So being aware of your risk factors, being aware of the prescriptions and drugs you're taking. I thought this was an interesting story that I came across recently. I was watching that somebody from England had moved here, and England uses their opioids a lot more sparingly than the U.S. uses them. And they moved here, and they were an alcoholic before and were recovering. So they already had an addictive personality. They moved here, and hurt themselves and went to the doctor, and I believe they hurt their back. I went to the doctor and said, I need help. My back hurts. And the doctor gave them a prescription for Vicodin. And without asking about their history for addiction, and this person immediately got addicted to opioids and started didn't realize that is what was happening, didn't realize that that's what they were taking, didn't realize anything. So they really trusted the doctor, that the doctor was doing what was right. And you should trust doctors, but you should also ask and be upfront about your health history, for sure. And so just be aware that the reason things have prescriptions is because they're, they should be taken in moderation. So take things as prescribed. And know the cycle and stages of addiction. So know that there is a cycle of addiction and be aware of it. And if you get caught in it, there is help out there. Seek help. There is free help at Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, which is a 12-step program. There are lots of local help organizations. This is just one at Contra Costa County. This is a national helpline that helps find medical treatment centers. There are a lot of good medical treatment centers that are not just 12-step programs, but help all around different type of issues. There are also help programs for family members as well. This is just two. There's Al-Anon and An-Anon. So these are programs of recovery for family and friends of addicts, whether or not the addict recognizes the existence of a problem. So if you feel like you are, you yourself need help because a loved one is an addict and you need help supporting that person, there are programs out there for loved ones as well. So there's a lot of ways to stay mentally and physically healthy out there by being aware and seeking help. So I hope you've learned lots about things today, and I will see you next week.